And so now you can see that the architectural styles that we discussed before, this is a sketch from my sketchbook. Well, both of these are, but you can see that they're very different in their general design, but you can see the influences. The one on the left is definitely a more traditional Gothic structure, like something you'd see in London or any of big European cities that feature Gothic architecture. But London specifically, you'll see a lot of stuff like this. In Spain as well, there's a lot of Gothic. Then you've got a complete, so that's a realistic take, right? Then you've got, again, talking about style, the image on the right, much more comic booky, much more graphic novel style, more graphic in general. And obviously the shapes are fantasy, giant moon in the sky lurking back there in the fog. There's just a lot going on that is much more fantastical. Not that that is totally unbelievable. It could be real. It's just not. In this case, it's invented. So again, looking at these different styles and different approaches to the same subject matter, you can see one is much more value based and softer, and one is much more silhouette based and harsher. Still plenty of gradients and ink bleed techniques and stuff like that in there. But it's important to know, again, the point of this chapter being it's important to know what you're actually going after. Without that direction, it's so easy to get lost just in the struggles with the technique. So that is a strong recommendation to make sure that you are aligned on and decided on what you're going after and what kind of technique and approach. It really doesn't take much. You may have 2 or 3 reference images on one side. That's the subject matter that I want. And then maybe 2 or 3 images on the other side that says, oh, that's the style. Reference images I'm talking about. That's the style I want to go after. So you're on a really good track if you can do both of those things. And so now you can see some of these styles being put into use. And I think there's some really fun applications here. You can see that style does sort of support what you're trying to do. Yes, you could do the image on the left with the style of the image that's on the right, but it's easy to see that when you commit to a style that fits the subject that you're trying to go after, it really enhances it. For example, the style on the left is a much more graphic and textury approach, right? You have silhouette, but the silhouette is not made with flat value. It's made with hatching and texture. And then the areas that are not silhouettes or shadow side filled with texture and hatching, it is just straight line, delicate line, and then pure black accents for the details. But it's still, when you go back to the reference image of the feudal Japanese architecture, it's still, even though this image is invented, it still feels like the essence of those structures where you have this big sloped or curving sometimes stone wall and maybe some rows of detail within that. And then you have the actual structure, the wooden structure on top of that, sitting on top of it, but it all flows together and the structure is more like a cap on top of it. I love the style, and it was a fun exploration to see how that could be implemented in a more fantastical way. Image on the right is a study. It started with a study or an inspired image from a photo of some of these beautiful small towns in rural China built along the river banks. And they have these they're raised up on these kind of stilts. So they sit over the top of the water, and you have cantilevered elements that hang out over the water. And it's like this on both sides. And it's just a beautiful amount of texture and detail. So naturally, you go with a little bit more of a painterly approach, and you can indicate all that repetitive detail very easily. You have the vertical and sometimes quirky off of center stilts and repeating windows. A looser style that kind of indicates that does really actually go a long way. So totally different approaches, but I think it's relevant to note that. And so now going into Renaissance, you go back and you start noticing the domes. You start noticing the archways. You start noticing the spires or turrets. You start noticing structures with these beautiful kind of dormers and these repeated windows and large areas of simplicity, and then areas of areas of rest, visual rest, and then areas of high frequency of detail. And then you got these archways and these beautiful pathways, long pathways, and things like that are typical of Renaissance. So again, the image on the right, totally different technique, much more simplified. It's about simple flat values. It's not really about rendering much. It's about line work and flat values to communicate local light and dark patterns, right? The roof is some kind of tile roof maybe, and maybe certain parts of the structure are painted a gray or a kind of a taupe color, or maybe it's actually has brown wood siding on it in those areas, and then plaster in the other parts, white plaster. I don't know. Image on the left, total fantasy, right? But it's not that fantasy if you compare the shapes to Duomo or some of these beautiful famous Renaissance architectural examples. It's not really doing much different, to be honest. You have things like this bridge between two buildings that looks a lot like stuff that you would see in Venice, for example, Venice, Italy. It's very Italian. It's very, it's a combination of the beautiful cities like Florence that embody the Renaissance, mixed with some of the more picturesque and romanticized countryside like Tuscany, and some of that. There's a little bit of that rolling hills with these medieval castles and stuff like that. So it's kind of a mixture of all those things, but that is the way to kind of digest that style. Moving into fantasy and sci-fi, now we're into something that is touching on something else. So there's been several examples so far of taking an architectural style from life and then adapting that to some other, sketch. Now you're talking about going in and into a more world building direction. This page here, these two images are from my other Learn Squared course, Sketching Anything, in which I kind of break down more of a design focus. The course is about design, not as much really technique. And so understanding like the image on the left, you're heavily leveraging Islamic architecture, right? It's very, it's kind of a mixture between Jimenez and, Macquarie, Tatooine a little bit, but maybe a little bit bigger of a mega city looking scale. So you get the best of both worlds. You get to draw the shapes that you know and love from Islamic architecture and some of these Middle Eastern cities with these beautiful dome shapes and these kind of very insulated structures that would hold up very well in sandstorms and things like that. Beautiful, beautiful designs. You get to incorporate that, and then you also get to make up crazier shapes and try to come up with ways to communicate grandeur and scale. So that's really a fun exercise. Image on the right, obviously referencing Bavarian castles and the German, Austrian impressive castles that are up on cliffs like Neuschwanstein and some of these incredible locations. These tall spires, these kind of roofs with the ridges on them, and the tiny little arches that come to a point, and the flying buttresses and everything like that. So it all kind of rings true. And once you understand the DNA of that architectural style, then it makes it so much easier to make things up. And so now going into more of a retro sci-fi, now you're going to see a different approach. You're not going to see the comic booky, line drawing approach, or you could, could certainly be that way in a Mobius kind of influence style or something along those lines. But this is more of John Berkey, John Harris territory, so that's another big influence of mine that I really enjoy studying. So you get the big, grand environments, crazy epic environments, ships, really big ships, really small, swarms of smaller ones, alien planets with crystal, desert looking ground plains and endless palm trees on a stark white sand, flat ground with mega, like, overly simplified mega structures from some kind of that almost look inspired by cruise liners or some of the bigger ships that humans have ever designed. It's inspired by those, so it has a graphic quality, but then there's a sensitivity and delicacy to the values. So it's a painting at that point. You're not doing like a comic drawing. It becomes kind of a painting. So especially with the image on the right. I mean, there's nothing different about that than a gouache painting, right? They're the same. So again, understanding the approach and what your references are. If you're staring at John Berkey and John Harris for weeks on end, you become obsessed with that stuff. Yeah, you're probably going to end up, or McCory for that matter, you're probably going to end up doing some more painting like techniques as opposed to the more drawing like techniques.